things should be promoted in the same ring. And that should be the dynamism of Japanese politics. And this is how our coalition government came about. And if it is possible, if we could have many, if we could develop a even greater, a better system in which representatives of various parties could discuss mutually. For concrete issues like for elections, when we can cooperate inter-party and within a group, I feel that we need to discuss even further in the future mutually. But I believe that although we are from different parties, we are united for making reform possible. And so I think that we are united in the same direction. And so I desire that we could solidify with a common goal. And I think that we will be able to display our full-fledged power in the ideal manner.
じゃあ私の方から申し上げます。今までの経過を踏まえた上で、
the second stage of the coalition government under Mr. Hara is going to set sail. Will this new cabinet, for having the new cabinet smoothly operate government, answering the expectations of the government, I think that I believe that each party is thinking of how to do this. I know that there is possibility for parties to form alliances, but this is something that the parties have to think about. And I believe that if things rise, we just hope that for smooth we would like to think about, we would like to make the basis of our thought. How smoothly can we go about promoting the new Hara coalition government? That was Mr. Murayama. Mr. Ishida, next. In points of reconfirmation was political reform. And as for the new system, we feel that we understand that we need to reconsider the electoral system. So then, political system for selecting our new government, which means we need to, because we have to look into the current electoral system. And so therefore I believe that an alliance with parties is extremely important. Komeito thinks this is important for selecting the new electoral system. As for Mr. Oji from the Japan Democratic Social Party, he says that as for the new administration, I would like to take this into consideration concretely. As for the Kaikaku no Kai, or the reform group, as for the process of decision-making for policies under Hosokawa administration, I know that I fully understand that there has been much difficulty on the part of who has been involved. Based on experience, I feel that there needs to be a new thought.
Hello, I'm Winona Jones, and we certainly want to welcome you to this edition of Pinellas Past. We have a most delightful guest with us tonight, Mrs. Bertha Pappas Hewless from Tarpon Springs. We've wanted to know some of the history of the famous Pappas restaurant for a long time now, and we're very excited that we have Mrs. Hewless with us tonight to explain how that restaurant got started, how her family arrived here from Greece, and what has happened to the family since that time so long ago. So, Mrs. Hewless, it's a distinct pleasure to have you with us tonight and to learn a lot about your family and the restaurant, and especially your parents and what they have meant to this community. So could we just begin a little bit with the early history of your parents? I believe you said that your mother was here before your father came over, and I've got it backwards.
Yes.
Okay. You tell us.
All right. Well, my father was born in 1888. He came to this country in 1904, and he was, I imagine, about 15, 16 years old. He had a sister which was older than he, and his father, when my father was born, his mother died at birth. So his father decided to bring them to America. So he brought them to New York, and she was about 17. His sister's name was Anna, and my grandfather found, I guess, a suitable husband for her, and he and his father sold peanuts and flowers in the polo grounds and drinks. And for a few, I think he stayed with my grandfather stayed with my father maybe a couple of years, and then he went back. In the meantime, my dad, which was about 17, started migrating to the south because he didn't like the cold weather. And on his way down, he stopped into Jacksonville, and he worked there as a dishwasher, a helper in the kitchen or whatever. But there was a famous chef from Athens, and he took a liking to my dad. So he took him under his wing and taught him a lot of the culinary ways of doing things. And Dad loved that. He loved cooking, and he loved anything to do with food and everything like that. So he went right into it. Well, then he started coming a little bit more to the south. In the meantime, the Army got him because it was the First World War.
Oh, okay.
And so he was inducted, I think, in 1917. I think that was it, yeah. And he served 2 years. He went to France, and he served in the Wildcat Division for the officers.
Division.
And he also was a cook for General Pershing.
Oh, so he was already cooking at that time.
Yes, he was a good cook by then. So then when he got out of service and the war was over, he came back to Florida. And he loved animals, and he loved ranching and that kind of thing, outdoors. He loved the outdoors. And he would, there was a Mr. Zigelli that he worked with, and they would get all the animals and things and strays, and he worked for Likes Brothers for a while. And then after a while, he settled in Tampa, Florida.
Okay, so the animals, and when he was doing that on the farm, it was a little north of Tampa.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And then when he came into Tampa, he decided to settle down and opened up a coffee shop right off of Franklin Street. And Old Fox was right across the street.
Oh, okay.
And being that he was of Greek descent, the people of Tarpon Springs, of course, we didn't have stores in Tarpon Springs then, department stores and household goods and so. The jitney, which you paid him 50 cents, would load up and bring the people to Tampa, and that was the stopping ground for the people to get off and meet to go back to Tarpon. So for 50 cents, you'd go to Tampa, do your shopping, eat at my dad's place, and then get back on the jitney and come back to Tarpon Springs. Well, when the big crash came, which was 1929,
about that?
Well, you know, it was pretty bad. But then before that, there was an uncle of mine. His wife was a sister to my mother, and they were from my mother was brought up and reared in Alexandria, Egypt.
Oh.
So this uncle was brought over by the Sponge Diving Association to do diving in Tarpon Springs. Well, he came over to make his lot first, and so he came over first, got himself situated, and then brought his wife, which was a sister to my mother.
Okay.
So they settled in Tarpon Springs. In the meantime, my uncle was good friends with my father from Tampa.
Right.
In the meantime, his wife, which was the sister of my mother, wanted her sister to come from Alexandria, Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So she convinced her husband to bring my mother over. In the meantime, you know how they used to make marriages?
Oh, of course.
Well, he knew that my father was a good catch, so he introduced him to his sister-in-law, and before you know it, we had a marriage.
Oh.
So then, when the crash came, we were living in Tampa.
Mm-hmm.
I was born in Tampa, so was Mike, and so was Lukey. So when we lost everything we had, so my daddy packed us up and brought us to Tarpon Springs.
All right, now that's the first three children
Were
of
born
the
in
family.
Tampa.
Okay.
I think I was about 6 years old, I think, when we were moved at the crash then, and we moved to Tarpon.
But you remember
I
that?
remember him putting us in this truck and loading us up with just our clothing, because our buildings were taken, our apartments were taken, everything. He lost everything because everything was taken away.
Right.
So he started again from scratch. So he came to Tarpon and he opened up another little restaurant right on the docks, which was in the middle of the sponge docks. But it wasn't quite big enough for what he wanted, and he wanted his own place. So he walked down the street. I don't know if you ever saw the old restaurant.
Oh, yes.
Which was down at the West End.
Mm-hmm. I've eaten there many times.
Well, it was a funny story because that building was an old sponge house.
Oh, was
and
it?
it was up on blocks.
Oh.
And he walked in, and Mr. Psilakis was in there, and he was a sponge buyer.
Mm-hmm.
And he said to him, you know, Mr. Psilakis, what you going to, he says, I'm getting ready to retire. If you want to buy this sponge house, you can have it. And he made the deal with Dad, and my dad bought it.
Oh.
And I think the payments were about $16 a month.
Oh, my
Can you believe
goodness.
that? And anyway, that's where he started. There was sawdust on the floor. There was tongue and groove walls. I mean, it was primitive. Because I wasn't even allowed to go in there because the divers were our customers. And, you know, there was beer and wine and stuff like that.
And it wasn't a tourist center at that time.
No, there was nothing but divers. And it was beautiful then with the docks, with the wooden docks and the sponge boats, 150 sponge boats abreast. It was a different world in Tarpon Springs.
Right.
It was magnificent. And the divers come in to eat, and Dad cooked special foods for them. Because when you went out on a diving boat, you had to have a rich soup, like algolemonos, a soup. Have you ever had that? The lemon and egg soup?
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
and tripe, you know, heavy tripe soups. That's what they wanted. And greens, and beef stew with onions, and moussaka and pastizo. So, you know, he cooked these meals for them, and they flipped out. So we had a big clientele of divers.
I see. Now, this would have been in the early 30s?
Well,
or
let's
a
see.
little-
I'm
maybe a
72,
little later.
yeah, 1938,
Okay.
35, 36, 37, 38.
Okay.
Yeah, that's just about. And then it lasted up until the Second World War.
Right.
You know what I mean? Then the government came in and bought up all the sponges and did all that, you know. And then the tourists started coming.
Right. After
And
the second.
That's
World
yeah.
War.
But then when the war broke out, you see, it took my oldest brother, and it took Luke. Jackie was only 14 years old, and it took my husband. I was 19 when I got married. So when my husband left and Mike left and Luke left and left me Jackie, it was only my dad, my mom, and I.
Oh my goodness.
And I was the top waitress, bottle opener, dishwasher, and everything.
How many waitresses did they have?
We didn't have but one, but when I left, there was 22. Now we got 100.
Yeah, but at that time, then if you were the only one, you did everything.
And then I hired Myrtle, and she was with us for 40 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, she's
well, I would say that sometime when you were there by yourself was probably the first time I was there.
Oh, true.
So you have probably been my waitress at one time.
I probably have.
And it was fantastic.
There was many people that still come in the shop and they remember me and know, you know, because I put about 25 years in there. Because I was there all the time by the time the boys got back from service. And then when Mike and Luke and Jack got back, then Mike, Luke, and my husband got back, Jackie went to college. So Mike came back and started remodeling, and we started expanding. We put on the blue room, then we put over the new bar, but then it wouldn't take care of all the people. The people were waiting in line for hours outside, and the parking got so bad that it was impossible. And then the kitchen we had was not possible to serve, you know, to take care of the people we were feeding.
Now let's go back just a minute, because you told me a little earlier
I forgot.
What kind of
stove, a wood stove.
And that was in the original one?
The old, the first restaurant, I mean, when we first opened, and Jackie would get it because if the wood was wet, we couldn't cook.
Right.
But then, of course, when the boys got back, they bought gas stoves, and we kept going upscale, and microwaves and everything else to go with it. But in those days, it was a wood stove, honey, and it was rough.
Dear.
And sometimes you just couldn't get it out. But then, you know, everything, I guess, comes to a good end when the new ways of doing things come to you. And when Mike got back, he started really putting in a first-class kitchen. Well, then...
Well, now your father and mother were still involved.
Oh, my God, my mother was right beside my mother.
Was she a cook?
No, but my father told her what to do. She was pretty good at it, but my dad was the one. She would help him roll stuffed cabbage and help him. See, we had to get this stuff, you had to go buy it. Well, you know, during the war it was terrible because you couldn't buy it. And you had OPA, you know, you had to have, they had to give you permission to go get so much sugar, so much butter, or so much oil. Well, you can't make a Greek salad without oil.
Yes, I know. My goodness, I hadn't thought of anything like that.
I used to get in an old truck and go to Ybor City and buy a small pint, anything. Any oil I could find, because there wasn't any.
Oh, dear.
We had it pretty rough for a while. But anyway, it all worked out.
You do use olive oil.
Well, we blend it because it's too heavy.
I see.
And we break down our vinegar a little bit. But you must put your vinegar on your salad first before your oil. And then my daddy died when he was 62 years old. He didn't really see all this that we have now. I mean, when they expanded and we built the restaurant in St. Petersburg, and that was a beautiful restaurant. My husband ran that. He was a controller for him for 35 years, and he ran the St. Pete restaurant. Then we got the big riverboat in Tampa.
Oh,
yes.
I'd forgotten about that one.
Yeah,
yes.
Pete ran that one, and then it was getting out of hand too much for us. So the boys decided that they would get rid of everything and build this big restaurant. I call it the Monster. Up on Dodecanese Boulevard, up on the corner.
Right. Well, let's stop just for right now. And as they say, we have to stop for one of those breaks. Okay. But I'd like to go back a little bit to the old restaurant before we get into the new one. But we'll come back and get into the building of the new one and so forth, too. Okay. So we'll be back in just a minute.
House. You don't have to worry about nothing. It's a real comfortable place.
In a historic neighborhood in Savannah, Georgia, longtime residents live in housing that might once have been torn down. In St. Louis, the Fox Theater becomes a year-round performing arts center in the heart of the city. In Galveston, Texas, the Alyssa, a tall ship built in 1877, sails on. What do all these places and things have in common? Well, for one thing, they're old. For another, they're tangible. You can see them, observe their fine qualities of design and workmanship, appreciate the way they fit into their surroundings. But most of all, they're being used in a variety of surprising and beneficial ways. And at the forefront, helping communities preserve their past in their own way, is the National Trust for Historic Preservation.
And welcome back to this segment of this show of Pinellas Past, when we're talking about the Pappas family and the restaurant that everybody all over the world actually is aware of. And our guest tonight is the eldest member of that family, Mrs. Bertha Pappas Hewless. And we want to go back just a little bit to the old restaurant. During our break, we were talking some about your father and the way he worked in that restaurant. Could you tell our audience how he spent so much?
It was a rough way to go, because he had to be up at 5, and he'd be down at the restaurant, and he'd be in the kitchen until, of course, serving time. And all his meals would be prepared and ready to be served. He'd serve them, and about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he'd go home for a rest for a couple of hours. Then he'd be back for the supper hour. And then he'd stay until about 8:39, or if the boys were there, he'd go on sooner. But the restaurant work is very, very, very hard. And if you don't ever worked in a restaurant, you know what I'm talking about.
I haven't, but just watching what goes on as a guest, I know that it has to be a tremendous pressure.
Well, there's no end to it.
Right.
You finish at night, and you got to start all over the next day, and it's 7 days a week.
Right.
And that's the way it goes, but that's the way it is, and that's all. You can't do anything about it, but just prepare that way.
Right. Well, at that time, did he have help with the cooking and so forth?
Oh, we had, well, I had to help. Well, we had some help. Yeah, he did. He had a couple of the old Greek men that didn't speak English, and they would work in the back, helping them clean potatoes or just do things like that. And we had girls in the dishwashing department and things like that. But not at the beginning, very little.
Right.
Because we didn't have the clientele that we have now.
Right.
Now everything is automated. But yes, it's too bad, though, he's not here to see the automation and what has happened.
It helps a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
What happened during the war?
Well, the whole world came to an end then, because it caught on. I guess the food, everybody just heard about it.
It was good.
It was good, and people were coming from Clearwater, from Tampa, all the way from the middle of the state to eat at the restaurant. Mm-hmm. And then MacDill Field and all the service people, they were finding it a haven to come to take their ties off and their hats, because it was a place they could relax without the MPs around. Mm-hmm. We had the crash boat base on one side and the Coast Guard base on the other side. And so it was just very busy. And a lot of those boys would help me during the war.
Oh.
They would come in and help, and, if we needed something done, they would help. Dad was good to them, though. Feed the soldiers, because we had our boys in service.
Right.
So a soldier walked in, he wanted, Bertha served, give the boys, you know, feed them. And that's the way it started, but slowly and very, it just seemed to just mushroom. And every day by day, it just got bigger and bigger and more and more. And by the time Mike and Luke got back, and my husband, the business was really flourishing. And then we had enough money there to start remodeling. So then we did our first remodeling. We did the one side. Then we took in the blue room, because everybody knew the blue room.
Right.
And then we fixed the bar side, and we did all that. And then it just got to the point where we needed more room. There was no parking or anything. And they thought it was getting too much for them, so they decided to sell the one in St. Pete and sell the riverboat. And they all got together, and all 7 of them got into the restaurant here, because this one here feeds 1,000. And
was that the old one?
No, the new one.
Yeah.
I mean,
how many did the old one
The
seat?
old one, about 450. And that's a lot of people to push out. With the banquet room upstairs at the new one, they might do a little better. But it's a lot of work. And the kitchen, see, we're not prepackaged. In other words,
absolutely.
everything is done from scratch. So, you know, everything has to be prepared.
Right.
And everything has to be cooked. It's not like you're going to stick it in the microwave and send it out. It's got to be done individually. So it takes more time.
Right.
Every salad, everything has to be placed on. It's not like you're going to go and find it already. It's fresh. It's got to be put that way. So that's the way it takes more time and takes more help. Our kitchen is gigantic in there. I don't know if you've ever been through it.
No, not.
But it's really a huge kitchen, because it's different departments. And all that's got to be prepared that way.
Right. Well, now, what about your mother?
Well, my mom stuck right with my dad.
But during this time,
Well, she was right there. Well, she had a gift shop, and she was always being pushed out. She was always on the side of the shop. First, she was in an alley. They pushed her out and took the alley. Then they put her in another little spot, and they pushed her out of that.
Oh, dear.
And pretty soon, they moved her across the street on the corner.
Oh.
So that's where my shop is now. I have
You
the
got
shop.
the shop
It's called
from your
Mama
mother.
Pappas's Gift Shop.
Right.
And that's why I never moved, because the restaurant was across the street from me. And then I'm getting too old to go any further, so I thought I'd stay where I am. So the boys moved up there, but they still come and see me, so it doesn't make any difference.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, now, what about your father's death? I know that was a shock to the whole community.
Well, it was just a sudden thing. He was having a little problem. We didn't know he had heart trouble. He just, all of a sudden one day, he was on the beach with me one day, and the next day he said, Bertha, I think I'm going to go home. And I think I'm more comfortable. He had a little bit of a cold. He went home, and my husband came back, and he said, you better come home now. I think your daddy's not feeling well. He had already died, but he didn't want to tell me. And we got home. He just sat on the edge of the bed and called out to my mother, and my brother Mike went in. We called Dr. Clough, and before you know it, he was gone. And that was the end of it. It was a very quick death. But my mother was sick for many years. She was a high diabetic, and she was nurses and doctors all for about 10 years.
So they both gave their life for
their children.
Right.
That's all they thought about was us kids. My boys and my girls, and that's all she thought about, and my dad thought about.
So when was the new restaurant built?
15 years ago.
Oh, I thought it'd been a little longer than that.
15 or 16, I've lost
something
count.
like that.
Something like that, yeah.
But that had not been in the plans while your father was still alive.
No, my mother saw it.
Ah, okay.
We took her up there in a wheelchair, and we wheeled her around. It was just opened, and we wheeled her around and took her upstairs to the banquet room, took her into the kitchen. We had a little party for her. I think she realized, I'm not sure, but I think she did. but she got to see it.
Oh, that
not
was
my dad.
That was excellent. I wonder if you can tell us the Greek name for your father. I mean, his name.
Well, it was Elias Michalis Papamichalopoulos.
Okay.
Pappas.
You see why I don't try to say it.
No. But a lot of people think we have a lot of relatives because there's a lot of Pappases.
Right.
But there's no relation because our name is Pappas Michael Polis. Now, a lot of people could be Papadopoulos or could be Papa Michael or whatever, but you just take the, we could have very well said Polis, or we could have very well said Michaels, because it's all in the
it's all in the in the name.
And they say that when your name is with Pappas, Papa, that you had a priest in your family. That's what designates your name.
I see.
So that's the way it goes. But he came from from Sparta.
Oh.
And I slept in his bed.
Oh.
I went up in the little village where he was from. Lekasandrivas also came from there. He's a big importer of Greek foods, like olives and peppers and feta and all that stuff. And they came from the same little town, from the same little village. And I went with my father's stepbrother, and we went up and spent 4 days there with my oldest brother, Mike.
Oh, that must have been...
It was beautiful, yeah.
Oh, you had to have enjoyed that.
I did, I really did.
And how many times have you been back to Greece?
About 10.
Oh, goodness. And
I'm going to Paris.
Oh.
In May. I'm going because my husband was stationed in France.
I see.
So he wants to take me back and show me where he was stationed, so I'm going.
Yeah. How many of the family are still in Tarpon Springs? Or what's
there's, out of the 5 children, 5 Pappas children, there's 8 boys and 8 girls. And out of the 8 boys and 8 girls, we've got 26 great-grandchildren.
Oh, my goodness.
And they all live around in Tarpon Springs.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That's why we have that big rec room.
Right.
Because when you get 65 or 70 people, when you get the mother-in-laws and the sister-in-laws and the cousin-in-laws and all, you've got to have a place like that to be able to house them.
Right.
And they built us a nice big rec room, and we have a huge fireplace, a swimming pool, a tennis court, and the little horses, and the kids can play.
Well, as usual, we find on a lot of these programs, we just don't have time to cover everything that we'd like to, but I want to thank you so much for being with us and sharing the history of this family with us. Those of us who have lived here for a long time know that not only do you have that restaurant that we all love, but you also have provided so much for the community, working with the church and some of the other things that you have done. And the Pappas family is very important to Tarpon Springs and to North Pinellas County. And so we do appreciate you being here and being with us to share with us. We thank you very much, Bertha. It's been a real joy to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertha.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? When you look in the mirror, do you see you, or do you see someone else? Are you perhaps trying to be someone else? Or maybe you're trying to wear somebody else's hat in life. You know, it's not going to really work, is it? Or maybe your conscience, sitting on your shoulder, is trying to tell you the truth. Well, you may be missing the greatest and richest blessings of life. Tonight we're going to help you to recognize your potential and your strengths and how to be able to stay positive in a negative society so that when you look in the mirror, you're really going to see you. And whenever you put on that hat, it's really going to be you underneath. And your conscience is going to say to you, you're really doing well. You're being positive in a negative society. So come on back to Winning in Life. We're going to have fun and we're going to help you tonight.
Welcome to the ministry of James K. Poe.